In this story, a wealthy black philanthropist arrives in a small insular town, aiming to improve its failing educational system. Instead of gratitude, he faces cruel suspicion, hostile stares, and constant scrutiny. Locals whisper about him behind his back, police officers treat him like a threat, and flighty community leaders question his every move. Baseless assumptions and racist undertones simmer beneath polite facades, while hidden agendas lurk in the background. As pressure builds, the audience witnesses blatant prejudice and corrupt maneuvering, an infuriating reminder of how easily fear and bias can poison a community's response to genuine help. Just after dawn, Dr. Nicholas "Nick" Ellis stepped out of his rental car and gazed across the quiet main street of Leon's Pass. He stood there for a moment, inhaling the cool, crisp air and taking in the well-worn charm of the small Midwestern town. Behind him, a line of low-slung shops and squat office buildings slumbered beneath a gentle morning haze. At the far end, he could see a modest courthouse with peeling paint on its shutters and a solitary green flag fluttering beneath the national colors. It looked more like a relic from a bygone era than a place where major decisions might be made. Yet Leon's Pass, population roughly 10,000, was where he'd chosen to finalize a delicate negotiation, one that could shape the future of hundreds of students and families back in the city. He stretched his shoulders. 20 years in corporate boardrooms and glossy event halls had taught him how to carry himself with unshakable confidence, but he'd long since traded the posture of pomp for something warmer, more human. At 45, Nicholas Ellis carried layers of experience. He was a self-made billionaire, founder of multiple tech ventures that had quietly revolutionized education access in underfunded communities. Yet at a glance, he looked more like a traveling schoolteacher than a titan of industry. Dressed in a soft gray cardigan and well-worn jeans, his beard neatly trimmed, and his dark brown complexion glistening faintly under the early light. If you didn't know him, you might assume he was just another friendly visitor passing through, and that's what he wanted. For now, anyway. There was too much at stake, and walking in broadcasting his identity would only cloud conversations. He didn't need special attention. He needed honesty, real insight into what was going on at the grassroots level. Once people realized who he was, Dr. Ellis, the man who had built a half-dozen scholarship programs from scratch, who funded health clinics and literacy projects, who could sway a senator's opinion with a single call, well, then everything would be colored by expectation, deference, possibly even resentment. He'd learned that people often treated him differently once they connected his name to the quiet empire he controlled. This morning, he sought none of that. He'd come to Leon's Pass incognito to understand the community's real attitudes toward the educational initiative he hoped to sponsor. He wanted to learn why some local leaders had stalled his proposals. Word had reached him that certain influential figures here took a dim view of wealthy city outsiders, especially a black man with power, coming in to fix their problems. Nicholas wanted to see firsthand if that sentiment was real or just whispered rumor. He crossed the street toward a small diner with a peeling sign that read, "Judy's Kitchen." The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon wafted through the open door, mingling with the faint diesel fumes of a passing truck. Pausing outside, he adjusted his glasses and smiled softly. The diner's big windows revealed a handful of customers inside. Two older men in baseball caps hunched over newspapers, a young mother trying to calm a fussy toddler, and a pair of teenagers tapping at their phones. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with auburn hair tied back in a kerchief, drifted between tables, coffee pot in hand. "Let's see what the morning brings," he murmured to himself, pushing open the door. Inside, the warmth of the diner's yellowish lighting brought out the cherry-red vinyl of the booths. There were photos on the walls, black and white images of the town decades ago, local sports teams grinning proudly, and a framed letter from some past mayor thanking Judy's Kitchen for its 50 years of service to the community. The linoleum floor, scuffed and dulled by countless footsteps, gave the place a comforting familiarity. It reminded Nicholas of places he'd known in childhood, back in Detroit, long before he founded Ellis Tech and changed the trajectory of his life. The waitress approached, a polite smile on her face. She wore a faded apron and had a no-nonsense kindness about her. "Morning, sugar," she said, voice carrying that lilting Midwestern warmth. "Pick a seat wherever you like. Want some coffee?" "Please," Nicholas said, choosing a booth by the window. "Black is fine." He settled in, resting his elbows lightly on the table's edge. He could feel the other patrons' sidelong glances lingering on him. It wasn't hostile exactly. Just curiosity. He was new, and they could tell. On top of that, he was a black man dressed too casually for a business trip, yet not quite a local farmer or trucker. Too well-groomed, maybe too at ease. He'd grown accustomed to this dance. Small towns often required a gentle approach from someone who looked like him. Over the years, he'd learned that prejudice could come in subtle shades: a delay in service, a forced smile, or an assumption about his profession. He'd been mistaken for a delivery driver when arriving at his own conference, and once was directed to the janitorial office in a building where he was the guest speaker. Being underestimated wasn't new. He just hoped this time would be different, or at least manageable. The waitress returned with the coffee and a menu. "Here you go. We've got pancakes today that are real good, and the breakfast special includes sausage or bacon, plus hash browns. You hungry?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, offering a grateful nod. "I'll take the special with bacon and add a side of fruit if you have it." She scribbled down the order and paused, taking in his quiet courtesy. Nicholas suspected a fraction of her mind was trying to place him. He didn't look like a town local. Maybe he was a reporter, a salesman, a wandering teacher between gigs. He gave her a warm, reassuring smile. "I'm just passing through," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Heard this was the best spot in town to get breakfast." She gave a knowing chuckle. "We do our best. Be right out with your order." As she left, the bell above the diner's door jingled. A trio of men entered, each wearing windbreakers with the local high school's logo. They exuded a casual confidence, talking loudly about last night's game. One of them, a man with weathered skin and graying stubble, shot a quick, appraising glance at Nicholas before guiding his companions to a booth near the back. Nicholas took a sip of coffee, enjoying the robust bitterness he needed to figure out how to blend in, how to learn about the community's stance on the education initiative without revealing who he was. He might start with local newspapers, maybe ask the waitress casually about the town's school board. There was supposed to be a meeting tonight at the courthouse about the grant he'd proposed, anonymous at first, to test how his philanthropic ideas were received. He couldn't help feeling a twinge of nervousness about what he might find: resistance, misunderstanding, maybe even hostility. His dream was to help more children access advanced learning tools. Why would anyone oppose that? But he knew the world well enough. Education was political, money could raise suspicions, and his being a wealthy black entrepreneur often roused unspoken questions. Did he have an agenda? Was he trying to impose urban values on a rural place? Nicholas had heard it all before. He'd prepared himself by doing his research, learning about Leon's past struggles, declining school enrollments, an outdated STEM curriculum, and a shortage of qualified teachers. His offer was a state-of-the-art online learning platform, training for local educators, and scholarships for promising students. On paper, it was a gift. In practice, it could be viewed as an intrusion. Leaning back, Nicholas let himself absorb more details. An old radio hummed softly in the background, playing a country tune. The mother with the toddler now sat near the window opposite him, trying to convince her child to taste scrambled eggs. The two older men reading newspapers occasionally looked up, glancing first at him, then at the headlines. If the newspapers here had covered the upcoming education proposal, Nicholas wondered what slant they'd taken. The local press often influenced public opinion well before any official meeting. He made a mental note to pick up a copy of the Leon's Daily Post after breakfast. Moments later, the waitress returned with a plate heaped high. Fluffy pancakes glistening with butter, crispy bacon, a neat portion of hash browns, and a small bowl of mixed fruit. "Enjoy, hon," she said, and he thanked her quietly. As she walked away, he noticed that one of the younger teens, a lanky boy with a hoodie, was eyeing his breakfast with envy. Nicholas offered a small nod and a friendly wink. The boy looked down, suddenly shy. The first bite was heaven, simple, hearty, and warm. After years of gourmet conference spreads and polished corporate lunches, a home-style diner breakfast tasted like comfort and sincerity. He savored it, taking his time and tried to imagine what it must be like to grow up here, where everyone knew everyone's name, and change came slowly. He'd always admired small communities, how they held on to traditions, how they looked out for neighbors, yet that insularity could also breed suspicion toward outsiders. He knew that all too well. As he sipped more coffee, his mind drifted to the meeting scheduled for that evening. He would attend as an observer, slipping into the back row of the courthouse hall. He wouldn't speak. Not yet. He wanted to see how the school board members and citizens talked about the proposal when they believed the benefactor was an anonymous donor. Only after he'd heard their honest opinions would he reveal himself. If they dismissed him, fine. He would simply take his offer somewhere else. But a part of him hoped they would welcome the chance. He wasn't here to boast or control. He wanted to collaborate, to empower local teachers and students with the digital tools that had changed countless lives elsewhere. Halfway through his meal, the trio of men in windbreakers caught the waitress's attention. "Hey Mary," the gray-stubbled man said, "we heard something about that fancy new digital grant coming down the pipe for the school. You know anything about that?" He spoke loudly enough for several nearby customers to hear, including Nicholas. Mary shrugged, topping off their coffees. "Just rumors," she said. "I heard the school board's meeting tonight to discuss it. Something about online platforms, scholarships, who knows?" The second man, younger and clean-cut, snorted softly. "Probably another out-of-towner thinking he can fix what ain't broken. Our kids don't need fancy tablets and online nonsense. They need common-sense education, good teachers, and a steady routine. We don't need someone swooping in to tell us how to run our schools." Nicholas stiffened slightly, though he kept his eyes on his plate. He wasn't surprised. He had anticipated this kind of skepticism, yet it still stung, a reminder that not everyone saw his efforts as helpful. Some saw it as meddling, maybe even a subtle attempt to push an agenda they couldn't control. Mary pursed her lips thoughtfully. "We'll see what the board says. Maybe it's a good thing Lord knows our school could use an update. Those computers are older than my grandkids' shoes." The older man with the gray stubble shrugged. "We'll see, I ain't holding my breath. Usually, these big promises just bring in complicated systems and people who don't know our way of life." Nicholas cut another piece of pancake, making sure his hand didn't tremble. He was glad to hear the exchange. This was why he'd come, so he could understand the nature of the resistance. It wasn't just about race or money, it was about identity and pride. They feared losing their local culture, their autonomy. The best way forward would be to show them that he respected those values and wanted to help them flourish on their own terms. But that was a dance that required trust, and trust wouldn't come easily. He finished his meal quietly, paid the bill with a generous tip, and stepped outside. The morning sun had grown stronger, warming the pavement across the street. A stack of newspapers sat in a vending machine. He walked over, fished out some coins, and retrieved a copy of the Leon's Daily Post. The front page mentioned the school board meeting, headlined, "Mystery Donor's Proposal Stirs Debate." Perfect, he thought wryly, tucking the paper under his arm. He'd read it later, in the privacy of his rented room. For now, he would wander the town, maybe talk to a few locals. He'd keep his identity quiet, observe, and learn. By the time the school board meeting began, he wanted a better sense of the town's pulse, the hope, the fear, the pride, and the prejudice. Then, he would decide how to present himself. Whether to reveal the truth that he was not just some out-of-towner, but Dr. Nicholas Ellis, a man committed to empowering communities without erasing what made them unique. He'd come a long way to be here, and he wouldn't leave without doing all he could to ensure respect, understanding, and growth. He started walking down the quiet sidewalk, the old courthouse looming ahead. The tension was subtle now, just a soft hum beneath the surface, but he could feel it. He knew it would grow louder as the day progressed, as expectations and misunderstandings collided. He took a deep breath. He was ready. Or as ready as anyone could be. Stepping into a world wary of change and outsiders, it was time to listen before speaking and show that even a wealthy, powerful man could approach with humility and heart. Nicholas stepped onto the sidewalk, the folded newspaper tucked under his arm, and headed down Main Street. The low hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves offered a quiet backdrop to his thoughts. He wanted to learn more about the community's position, before the meeting tonight, and the best place to start might be the public library. It was only a few blocks away according to the map he'd memorized. Maybe local archives or school records could shed light on what he was up against. As he passed a small hardware store, he noticed the figure behind the window watching him, an older gentleman with a stern gaze. Nicholas tried a friendly nod, but the man only narrowed his eyes and turned away. Subtle, yes, but the cold reception dug at Nicholas's confidence. He could guess what was going through the man's mind. Who is this stranger? What's he doing here? He walked on across the street. An antiques shop's door stood ajar, the dusty window filled with faded quilts and old road signs. Just beyond that was a stationery store where a woman rearranged postcards on a spinning rack. She looked up, saw him, and paused mid-movement. Nicholas had encountered such moments countless times. He knew he didn't fit neatly into the picture they had of a respectable local businessman. He was black, well-spoken, but dressed casually, and somehow that threw people off. They expected difference, they just never seemed sure how to categorize it. Sometimes that confusion morphed into suspicion. He tried not to dwell on it, but the discomfort built in his chest. He kept going, determined to stay open-minded and composed. When he finally reached the library, a squat red brick building with wide steps and a brass handle on the heavy door, he felt a small relief. Public libraries were universal havens, places where he hoped knowledge mattered more than appearances. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor polish. A librarian, her name tag read Mrs. Albright, stood behind a desk. She wore bifocals and had a gentle, lined face. "Morning," Nicholas said quietly, stepping up to the desk. He kept his voice calm and respectful. "I'm hoping to look at some recent local news coverage or school board reports. Could you help me find the archives?" She regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, we keep local papers and school records on microfilm and digital archives in the reference room down the hall, third door on the left." "Thank you," he said, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe here, no one would question his motives. He started down the hall, footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. He'd barely rounded the corner when he heard the front door open behind him and the sharp voice of a man greeting the librarian. Nicholas paused, lingering out of sight but within earshot. The tone bristled with authority. He heard the librarian's hushed response. "Oh, officer, I didn't realize..." Nicholas's heart sank. He took a step toward the reference room, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the low rumble of the man's voice drifted down the hall. "Just checking in," the voice said almost casually. "We've had reports of a stranger walking around town this morning. Thought I'd do a quick look. No trouble, I hope?" The librarian's voice lowered. Nicholas strained to listen. "No trouble that I've seen. There is a gentleman in the back, looking up records. He asked about school board reports." His stomach tightened. He continued toward the reference room, telling himself not to overreact. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet, the back of his neck prickled with that old familiar feeling of being singled out. He decided not to flee. Better to face whatever this was. Calmly. The reference room was small and quiet, lined with shelves of bound newspapers. A dusty computer with a microfilm viewer sat in the corner. Nicholas pulled out a chair and opened the newspaper he'd brought with him, trying to appear focused and at ease. He'd scarcely settled when he heard footsteps approaching. A figure stepped into the doorway. A police officer in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed mustache. His uniform was crisp, his gaze direct. Nicholas looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good morning, officer," Nicholas said, keeping his voice steady. The officer nodded curtly. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Nicholas's newspaper and then the shelves of archives. "Morning," he said, his voice measured. "Looking for something specific?" "Just some local news coverage," Nicholas replied. He decided to be honest. "I'm interested in the school board discussions. There's a meeting tonight, I believe." The officer folded his arms, the leather of his utility belt creaking softly. "You from around here?" Nicholas shook his head. "Visiting, just passing through." The officer's eyes narrowed, as if he'd uncovered something suspicious in that simple fact. "Got any ID on you?" Nicholas swallowed. He had his driver's license, of course. The request, though not overtly hostile, carried a certain sting. He'd done nothing suspicious beyond existing in their town. Still, he reached into his pocket carefully and handed over his license. The officer studied it, then glanced back at Nicholas. "Detroit," the officer remarked. "Long way from home. What kind of visit brings you to Leon's Pass?" Nicholas felt a flicker of annoyance, but kept his tone civil. "I'm interested in rural education initiatives. Just wanted to get a feel for the community before tonight's board meeting." The officer handed the license back, expression still guarded. "We don't get many city folks taking interest in our schools out of the blue. You working for someone, a reporter maybe?" Nicholas slid his license away. "I'm not a reporter," he said calmly. "Just a concerned citizen who cares about education." A moment stretched. The officer's posture relaxed, slightly, but Nicholas could still feel the skepticism thick in the air. "All right," the officer said. "Just keep it civil tonight. Some folks get mighty protective of how we do things here." Nicholas nodded, relieved the interrogation seemed to be winding down. "Of course, officer, I understand." The policeman gave a curt nod and stepped back into the hallway. Nicholas waited until he heard receding footsteps before releasing a quiet sigh. He'd maintained composure, but the bitterness of that encounter lingered. He was a grown man, a respected philanthropist, yet he was made to feel like a suspect. He turned to the computer, booted it up, and searched for recent articles about the school board's deliberations. Headlines passed before his eyes. "Local teachers resist outside intervention. Anonymous donors offer raises questions. Pride versus progress. The debate over modernizing our schools." He read quickly, noting the repeated concerns about outside influences. Some editorials all but accused the mysterious donor, him, though they didn't know it, of trying to impose a big city agenda. After about an hour, Nicholas stepped out of the library, blinking at the midday sun. He'd gained insights. None reassuring resistance was real, and his presence here was already stirring curiosity and suspicion. He wondered how they'd react when he revealed himself. If they treated him this way when they thought he was nobody, how would they treat him when they realized he was a wealthy black entrepreneur with enough resources to reshape their educational landscape? His next stop was the courthouse. Not to interfere, but to get a sense of the meeting room's layout and maybe speak unofficially with a clerk about attendance procedures. He walked slowly, trying to shake off the lingering tension. On the way, he passed a clothing boutique. Through the window, he saw a small sign that read, "Welcome all." It made him smile a little, but as he stepped closer, a saleswoman inside seemed to track his movement warily. Nicholas decided not to go in. He had no reason to invite another uncomfortable encounter. Turning a corner, he spotted a patrol car parked near the courthouse steps. Another police officer stood beside it, talking with a man Nicholas recognized from the diner, the gray-stubbled fellow who'd been skeptical of the digital initiative. The man's expression was guarded as he gestured toward Nicholas with a subtle tilt of his chin. The officer's gaze followed the man's cue and landed on Nicholas, who tried his best to appear unbothered, lifting the newspaper he still carried as if examining the headlines. He didn't need to be paranoid to guess their conversation topics. He was the new variable in a tightly knit community, and he stood out in ways that made people uneasy. He took a breath, urging himself to stay calm. There was no crime in curiosity. Still, it stung that they felt the need to scrutinize him at every turn. Climbing the courthouse steps, Nicholas entered a foyer lined with old wooden benches and dusty potted plants. A metal detector and a bored-looking security guard greeted him at the main entrance to the chambers. He emptied his pockets, phone, keys, the folded newspaper, and stepped through. The guard barely glanced at him, which was a small mercy inside. He found a clerk's office and approached a short counter where a young woman typed at a computer. "Excuse me," Nicholas said softly. "I was wondering if tonight's school board meeting is open to the public?" The clerk looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone right now. She adjusted her glasses. "Yes, it's open," she said. "Seating might be limited, but anyone can attend." Nicholas nodded, relieved at her neutral tone. "Will there be a sign-in sheet or any protocol?" "Usually not," she replied. "Just show up. Sometimes they call for public comments, but it depends on the agenda." "Are you from a local group?" He shook his head. "No, just a visitor interested in education matters." She frowned slightly, as though trying to make sense of him. Then she shrugged. Feel free to sit anywhere, doors open at 6. Thanks, Nicholas said, offering a warm smile. As he turned to go, he nearly bumped into a tall, balding man entering the office. The man wore a pinstriped suit and carried a leather briefcase. He eyed Nicholas critically before addressing the clerk. "Joyce, I need the updated attendance list for tonight's session," he said, ignoring Nicholas's presence. Nicholas stepped aside, but the man, most likely a lawyer or a school board official, gave him a once-over as if expecting Nicholas to apologize for standing there. Nicholas offered a polite nod and left, noticing how the man's gaze lingered with a mix of suspicion and dismissal. Back on the steps outside, the earlier officer had moved on, but the gray-stubbled townsman remained near a lamppost, talking to another local. Their conversation stopped abruptly as Nicholas walked by. He met their eyes briefly, searching for some hint of friendliness. They just stared, their silence thick with judgment. A tightness gripped Nicholas's chest. His earlier calm was wearing thin. He reminded himself why he was here: to help children, to improve education, to bring resources where they were needed. Yet every look, every question, felt like a pushback against his very presence. He fought the rising anger and frustration. He'd spent his life learning to channel that energy into productive action. Still, it hurt. And it was hard not to feel the weight of old wounds. He decided to return to his rental car. He'd booked a small room at a local inn on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a place to rest, gather his thoughts, and prepare for the evening. He strolled down a side street, trying to avoid the main drag where he'd drawn so much attention. 3 blocks later, he approached a small convenience store. Thirst nagged at him. A bottle of water might help clear his head. As he entered, a bell tinkled overhead. The store was cramped, aisles packed with snacks and household basics. Behind the register stood a young man with sandy hair, flipping through a magazine. Nicholas moved to the cooler and grabbed a bottle of spring water. He noticed in his periphery that the cashier had stiffened, his eyes locked on Nicholas's every move. When Nicholas approached the register, the young man snapped the magazine shut and frowned. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, voice terse. Nicholas raised the water bottle slightly. "Just this, please." The cashier studied him. "Cash or card?" "Card," Nicholas said, reaching slowly for his wallet. The cashier's posture radiated mistrust. "We have a minimum for card purchases," he said. $5. Nicholas glanced at the dusty sign taped to the counter. It said nothing about a minimum. He chose not to argue. "All right, I'll grab a snack to meet the minimum." He selected a bag of almonds and returned to the counter. The cashier rang up the total and handed the card reader over, as if it were a dangerous object. Nicholas keyed in his PIN, waiting patiently. The cashier huffed softly, as if inconvenienced. The transaction took an extra second to process, and Nicholas could feel the man's suspicion in the silence between them. When the receipt finally printed, Nicholas offered a polite, "Thank you." The cashier said nothing, just watched him leave, eyes narrowed. Outside, Nicholas took a sip of water and stood still, letting the afternoon light warm his face. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface. He'd done nothing but exist in their space, and for that, he was treated like a potential threat, a nuisance. In his mind, he ran through the coping strategies he'd learned over decades. Keep calm, show understanding, prove them wrong through patience and kindness. But how many times must he prove himself to people who had already made up their minds? As he neared his car, he saw a police cruiser idling at the corner. The officer behind the wheel watched him approach. Nicholas tried not to sigh. There was no reason to fear he'd done nothing wrong. Still, his heart thudded. He opened the car door carefully, stowed the newspaper and water, and started the engine. The cruiser didn't move. He pulled away slowly, following all the rules, and in his rearview mirror saw the cruiser's headlights blink on. It followed him for 2 blocks before turning off down another street. By the time he reached the little inn, a converted farmhouse with a small gravel lot, he felt drained. He parked and just sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. Tonight's meeting would be tense, he realized. If this was how they treated a lone black man passing through town, how would they handle the truth that he was their prospective benefactor? A man with influence, resources, and the power to change their community for good. Yet he could not let his anger overtake him. He had a duty to those children who deserved better educational opportunities. He had to remain calm, professional, and composed, no matter how unjust the treatment. He reminded himself of the countless students he'd helped over the years, bright faces lighting up when given the chance to learn coding or receive a scholarship. Those faces mattered more than the scowls and suspicions he'd faced today. With a steadying breath, Nicholas stepped out of the car and headed inside the inn. He'd review his notes, reflect on what he'd learned, and strategize tonight. He'd attend the board meeting and see if anyone in that crowd was willing to meet him halfway. He knew his presence challenged their assumptions. Maybe, just maybe, once they understood his intentions, something would shift. He wouldn't give up, but he could feel the tension building, a quiet storm of prejudice and pride. The next step would be crucial, and he had to be ready for whatever awaited him in that courthouse meeting room come evening. Nicholas stood before the mirror in his small inn room, adjusting the collar of his shirt. He'd chosen something simple yet professional for tonight's meeting: a crisp white button-down, dark slacks, and polished loafers. He wanted to radiate confidence without seeming arrogant. With one last smooth of his hand over his shirt front, he breathed deeply. The time had come. Outside, dusk was settling over Leon's Pass. The lamplights flickered on, illuminating the quiet streets. He stepped onto the porch and walked to his car. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and distant bonfires. He couldn't help noticing how empty the sidewalks were. No lingering neighbors or laughing children. It felt as if the whole town was waiting to see what would unfold inside the courthouse tonight. He drove slowly toward the center of town, passing the diner he'd visited that morning, now lit by soft neon glow. He saw silhouettes of patrons through the windows, heads turned as he rolled past. Word had probably spread about the stranger in town. He turned a corner and found the courthouse parking lot buzzing with cars. Already, a small crowd formed near the entrance. Nicholas parked at the far end of the lot, took a long breath, and walked toward the courthouse doors. A few people eyed him warily. He recognized the gray-stubbled man talking to a companion. The man didn't speak, just fixed him with a stern look, and then shook his head, as if disgusted. Nicholas pressed on, shoulders squared, heart pounding. He would face whatever came. Inside, the meeting room hummed with anxious chatter. Rows of folding chairs were arranged before a long table where the school board members would sit. A makeshift podium stood off to the side, and a microphone squealed lightly as someone tested it. The crowd was larger than Nicholas expected. Dozens of locals, some young, some old. Their voices mingled in low murmurs. He found a seat toward the back. He wanted to observe first. The clerk, Joyce, bustled around, handing out copies of the agenda. Two board members, one a stout man with a gold tie, another a stern-faced woman, conversed quietly at the head table. No one had formally started the meeting yet, but tension thickened in the air. "Is that him?" someone whispered from a row ahead. "The outsider?" "He was snooping around the library," another voice answered, "asking about our schools." A woman hissed, "Quiet, he'll hear you," as if Nicholas were an animal prone to spooking. Nicholas tried to focus on steadying his breathing. He reminded himself that he was here to help tonight. He'd reveal who he was, the philanthropist behind the proposed educational platform. Maybe then they'd understand he meant no harm, yet a tiny doubt nagged at him. What if they refused to hear him out? Just as the board members began settling in, the door opened. Officer Daniels, the policeman who'd questioned Nicholas at the library, stepped in and took a position along the wall, arms folded. He caught Nicholas's eye and nodded, but it wasn't a friendly gesture. It felt more like a warning. A gavel tapped the board chair. The stout man in the gold tie spoke. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Marcus Tyler, chair of the Leon's Pass School Board. We're here tonight to discuss the new educational initiative that has been proposed, though the donor remains anonymous." His voice held a note of skepticism. "We understand there's interest and concern. Let's proceed in an orderly fashion." The meeting began with routine matters: old business, a mention of repair work needed in one of the classrooms, a line item about next month's fundraisers. The audience shifted restlessly. Nicholas waited, leaning forward in his chair, listening closely. He noticed that one of the board members, a slender man with wire-rim glasses, seemed hesitant, uncomfortable. Even he kept glancing at the crowd, as if looking for someone. Then they arrived at the main agenda item: discussion of the proposed digital education grant. Marcus Tyler cleared his throat. We've received an offer, substantial funding, software resources, teacher training, scholarships, but we know next to nothing about who's behind it. That raises questions about motives, conditions, and the kind of values this donor might be pushing on our curriculum. A rumble of agreement rolled through the audience. Nicholas felt his pulse quicken. This was it. Another board member, the stern-faced woman, Ms. Little, spoke up. I've heard rumors that this donor might be from out of state, maybe from a big city, someone who doesn't understand our community. If that's true, we have every right to be wary. Nicholas drew a breath to stand, but a voice from the crowd cut in first. What if this is all some trick? Called the gray-stubbled man. He stood near the back, arms crossed. Some fancy-pants city fellow trying to get a tax write-off or force us to use their company's products? A murmur of assent followed. Nicholas rose to his feet, heart pounding. Excuse me, he said softly. He stepped into the aisle, raising a hand. I'd like to speak. All eyes snapped to him. Officer Daniels stiffened. Marcus Tyler peered down from the front table. You are... Nicholas approached slowly, choosing his words carefully. My name is Nicholas Ellis. I'm visiting from Detroit. I've spent my life working to improve access to quality education for underserved communities. The proposal you're discussing tonight, I'm responsible for it. A shocked hush fell. Then a few gasps, uneasy shifts. Nicholas could almost feel the tension thrumming in the stale air. Ms. Little frowned deeply. You mean you're the donor? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. I wanted to see how you'd react to the idea on its own merits. Without knowing who I am, I hoped that would show me what concerns truly mattered to you. Murmurs erupted. Officer Daniels took a step closer, hand resting near his holster. The gray-stubbled man shook his head, muttering something Nicholas couldn't make out. Marcus Tyler's voice grew cold. So you came here in secret, asking questions around town, stirring suspicion. That's not how we do things, Mr. Ellis. Nicholas held up a hand. I understand your caution, but my intentions are pure. My organization has helped schools across the country modernize their curriculum while preserving local values. I'm not here to replace your identity. I'm here to offer resources and training that could help your students thrive. A voice from the front row called out, Why not come forward at the start? What are you hiding? Nothing, Nicholas said, feeling the sting of misunderstanding. I've seen firsthand how preconceptions can cloud honest dialogue. I wanted your honest reactions. And what if we say no? Demanded someone else. Nicholas's shoulders tensed. Then I respect that decision. I'm not forcing anything on you. At that, Officer Daniels cleared his throat loudly. This man was seen all over town today, he announced. Questioning people, snooping around. Folks felt uneasy. Maybe we should verify his identity, make sure he's who he claims. Nicholas's jaw clenched. I'm happy to provide verification, he said calmly. He reached into his pocket for his wallet. Slowly, Daniels warned, stepping forward. The room's mood darkened. Nicholas's every movement felt scrutinized. He withdrew his ID gently, holding it up so Daniels could see. Here's my license. He reached for his phone. I can show you my business credentials, my website, press coverage. Hold on, Marcus Tyler said, raising a hand. He looked at Ms. Little, who leaned over and whispered something to him. Tyler nodded and addressed the room. We have a right to ask questions, Mr. Ellis. If you truly come in peace, let's see some concrete proof. How do we know this isn't some scam? Before Nicholas could answer, there was a scuffle by the door. A young man, Mitchell, the librarian's assistant Nicholas had spoken to briefly when looking through archives, stepped forward. Mitchell's eyes darted nervously around. I recognize him, Mitchell said. Not just from today, I've seen his name in educational development articles online. He's legitimate. Nicholas felt a spark of relief. An ally, finally. But Officer Daniels looked unimpressed. We still need to be sure. Show us something official. Nicholas pulled up his company's website on his phone. A well-known, highly respected foundation. He approached the front table, extending the phone. Tyler examined it. Ms. Little peered over his shoulder. Their eyes flicked with recognition as they saw the testimonials, photos of Nicholas, with renowned educators and community leaders from across the country. Murmurs of confusion filled the room. The gray-stubbled man crossed his arms tightly. Even if he is who he says he is, what gives him the right to come in here like this, sneaking around? Nicholas tried to keep his voice steady. I'm sorry if my approach unsettled you. I needed to understand the root of your concerns, without the filter of my reputation. I know trust must be earned. Ms. Little looked up from the phone. If you're genuine, why not meet with us privately first? Why not build relationships before proposing changes? I should have, Nicholas admitted. That was my mistake. I've learned that your community values transparency and local input. I respect that. Tyler cleared his throat, looking as though he might soften. But before anyone could respond, Officer Daniels took a step closer to Nicholas, his posture challenging. Regardless, Mr. Ellis, it's suspicious how you've been prowling around. Some folks said you were making them uncomfortable. For the sake of safety, I need to ask you to come with me so we can clear this up officially. Nicholas's heart sank. I haven't broken any laws, officer. I'm simply here at a public meeting. You stirred people up, Daniels cut in. People said you were lurking near the courthouse earlier, peering in windows. That's trespassing, isn't it? I only looked at a posted notice. Nicholas's voice rose slightly, anger creeping in. He fought it down. This is unfair. The room's tension skyrocketed. The townspeople shifted anxiously. Mitchell opened his mouth, as if to protest, then hesitated. Joyce, the clerk, hovered at the edges, looking distressed. Some audience members whispered, and Nicholas caught fragments. Maybe he's trouble. We can't just arrest him. What's he really want? Marcus Tyler rubbed his temples. Officer, maybe this is unnecessary. But Daniels was on a roll. I think we should verify him down at the station. Do a background check. Can't be too careful. He reached out, his fingers closing around Nicholas's upper arm in a firm grip. Nicholas jerked back instinctively. I'm not resisting, he said, voice tense. Please, you're making a mistake. The officer's grip tightened. The crowd gasped. Nicholas's mind raced. He had no desire to be arrested over misunderstandings and prejudice. This was about more than him now. It was about standing for what was right. If he allowed them to treat him like a criminal for daring to offer help, what did that say to everyone in the room? Mitchell stepped forward, voice shaking. Officer Daniels, this isn't right. He's done nothing wrong, just listen to him. Daniels shot Mitchell a warning glance. Stay out of this. Nicholas gritted his teeth. He'd come so far, tried so hard to remain calm, he forced his voice steady. Officer, you are overstepping. I have offered full transparency. If you arrest me without cause, that's a serious mistake. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. Ms. Little stood abruptly, rattling the table. We can't just arrest a man who came here to explain himself, officer. Stand down. But Daniels was stubborn. He'd found a scapegoat for the community's fears. With a sneer, he reached for his cuffs. We'll let the station sort this out. Wait, Marcus Tyler's voice boomed. He looked genuinely alarmed now, sweat beading on his brow. I don't think we need to escalate this, Mr. Ellis. His tone wavered. If you'll just step outside with Officer Daniels and answer a few questions. Nicholas shook his head. I won't go quietly if I've done nothing wrong. The room erupted into argument. Some people shouted at Daniels to back off, others urged Nicholas to comply, a few hissed that he should have stayed away. In the chaos, Nicholas realized something. He had to stand his ground. If he caved, they'd never treat him as an equal. If he fought, he risked everything. He lifted his chin, voice firm. I'm here to help your children, I'm not a threat. If you arrest me now, you send a message that no good deed can penetrate your fear. Officer Daniels tightened his jaw, raising the cuffs. Nicholas braced himself. Ms. Little moved to intervene, and Tyler stood, looking desperate. Mitchell seemed on the verge of shouting. The tension reached a fever pitch, voices overlapping, emotions surging. In that charged moment, it felt like a single spark could ignite a disaster. Nicholas's heart hammered. Would he end up in a cell tonight? Would all his work and goodwill crumble before these frightened eyes? He searched the crowd, looking for a sign of reason, an ally who could break this madness. He found Mitchell's eyes, saw them flick with resolve. The young man stepped forward again, this time raising his voice. "You can't do this, officer, you're—" A sudden crash outside made heads whip around. The door banged open, and another official rushed in, breathless. Daniels paused, cuff half raised, and Tyler shouted, "What's going on?" The newcomer's panicked face caught the room's attention. "There's a problem, urgent," he cried. "We need everyone outside now." In that frozen instant, Nicholas stood locked in place. Daniels hovered inches away. The board members looked torn, the crowd confused. A crisis had just interrupted this injustice, dangling a moment of possible salvation or greater chaos. Nicholas's heart pounded as the frantic newcomer's voice echoed off the courthouse's wooden walls. For one charged second, no one moved. Officer Daniels hovered dangerously close with a set of handcuffs poised mid-air. Marcus Tyler stood half-risen from his chair, and Ms. Little gripped the table's edge so hard her knuckles whitened. Mitchell's eyes darted between Nicholas and the officer, silently urging calm, some kind of reason. Then Tyler found his voice. "What's the emergency?" he demanded, half shouting to be heard over the anxious murmur of the crowd. The newcomer, a wiry young intern from the clerk's office, Nicholas guessed, flushed with panic. It's outside, by the old school annex. A crowd's formed, shouting about corruption and blocking the entrance. Someone said they have documents proving the board's been hiding something about the funding. It's turning ugly." A ripple of alarm swept the room. Nicholas registered the words. Corruption. Hiding something. Was that the root of all this suspicion? Even as he struggled to parse this new development, he recognized an opportunity. If someone else was accusing the board of wrongdoing, maybe the spotlight would shift, forcing people to reconsider him. But it also meant chaos, and in chaos, he might lose any chance to speak clearly. Daniels glared at Nicholas, uncertain. In front of them, Marcus Tyler grimaced. "Everyone, remain calm," the chair said, voice cracking slightly. He turned to Ms. Little. "Go see what's happening." Then, eyeing Nicholas, Tyler hesitated. "Officer, keep him here until we sort this out. We can't have him running off if—" Nicholas interjected, voice firm. "I'm not running off, I came here to help. If there's something wrong with the board's practices, don't you think I'd want it exposed too? My entire goal was transparency." Ms. Little's jaw tightened. She looked torn, as if some deeply held assumption about Nicholas was eroding. Finally, she nodded to Tyler and slipped through the crowd toward the door. Voices rose outside, muffled but intense. The tension inside only sharpened. Officer Daniels tightened his grip on the cuffs, and for a moment, Nicholas thought the officer might still force the arrest. But Daniels seemed distracted, his authority shaken by the mention of corruption. "Don't move," he warned Nicholas, voice flat. "I mean it." Nicholas raised his hands slightly, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "I'm not your enemy." Mitchell stepped up beside Nicholas, squaring his shoulders. He was younger, smaller, and visibly nervous, but he addressed Daniels clearly. "You can't just arrest him for no reason. If you do, you'll be playing right into the hands of whoever is trying to discredit this meeting." Tyler cleared his throat. "Mitchell, let's not jump to conclusions. We need order. Everyone remain seated until we know what's going on." The chair's voice faltered, revealing that he was losing control of the room. A woman at the back called out, "If there's corruption, we deserve to know. Is this about those outdated textbooks we've been complaining about for years?" Another voice, "Or the missing funds for the computer lab last year?" Nicholas felt the crowd's mood shifting. Doubt was no longer solely directed at him. It now spread toward the board and the officer trying to muzzle him. As if on cue, Ms. Little returned, cheeks flushed. She didn't come alone. The gray-stubbled man followed, holding a folder stuffed with papers, his expression grim. Behind them trailed half a dozen townsfolk, their faces set with determination. "Marcus," Ms. Little said, raising her voice to cut through the din. "This man, Warren, claims to have emails and contracts showing that the school board was approached by private contractors who wanted to block any outside educational initiatives. They allegedly offered kickbacks if we refused all grants, including the one Mr. Ellis proposed." A stunned silence fell. Tyler's face went beet red. "That's nonsense," he sputtered. "We've never— Who gave you this junk?" Warren, the gray-stubbled man who had eyed Nicholas with such distrust earlier, held up the folder. "I got these from an anonymous source who said this meeting would be crucial. I thought it was some trick, but seeing how you treated this man here," he nodded toward Nicholas. "I got suspicious. I went outside when I heard the commotion, and someone handed me these." Nicholas blinked, stunned. For hours he'd been the villain in their eyes, but now new villains emerged from the shadows: corruption, bribes. It wasn't just fear of outsiders. Someone on the board might have been paid to keep the town's schools outdated and dependent on old ways. His heart panged. These children were being cheated out of opportunities for someone else's profit. Daniels's grip on the cuffs slackened. He glanced at Tyler, searching for cues. If the board was implicated in wrongdoing, the officer's earlier aggression toward Nicholas would look even worse. Nicholas sensed Daniels's hesitation. This was no longer a simple narrative of outsider equals threat. Mitchell shot Nicholas a glance of relief, as if to say, "You see, truth comes out." Tyler reached for the folder, but Warren stepped back. "No, if these are real, I'm not giving them to you to lose. I want the public to see them. We all deserve to know if our leaders are selling out our kids." The room erupted in shouted questions and accusations. Tyler tried to regain control. "Everyone, please calm down. We must follow proper procedures." "Procedures?" someone yelled. "You were about to have an innocent man arrested." "Why did you try to stop him from speaking?" another added. Nicholas stood in the midst of the storm, feeling the tides turn. He'd come here to help, and now, ironically, these revelations might prove his sincerity. But he couldn't just stand there and watch. He needed to act decisively. Channel this energy toward truth and reform. He raised his voice above the clamor. "Listen, please." He stepped forward, careful not to make any sudden moves that might startle Daniels. "I came here because I believe in your students. I believe in your community. If there's corruption, then shining light on it is the first step to healing. These documents should be reviewed by an impartial party, maybe a state education official or an independent auditor." Some nodded, relieved to hear a constructive suggestion. Ms. Little looked at Nicholas, and he saw regret in her eyes, as if she wished she hadn't doubted him so quickly. Tyler, sweat shining on his brow, tried another tactic. "We can't trust these papers, they might be forged." His voice wavered. "We need time to verify." But Warren stepped closer, shaking the folder. "I recognize some of these email addresses. They belong to certain board members. Tell me, Mr. Tyler, do you deny emailing a private contractor named Belford Consulting last month?" Tyler paled. His silence was all the confirmation the crowd needed. A rumble of outrage spread. Officer Daniels stepped back, as if trying to dissociate himself from the crumbling authority. Nicholas lowered his voice, speaking to Daniels. "Officer, I'm not resisting. You see now that my intentions were never harmful. We have a bigger issue on our hands. Will you help ensure this evidence is properly handled instead of focusing on arresting me for no cause?" Daniels's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. He looked from Nicholas to Tyler, then over to Ms. Little. Finally, he nodded stiffly, pocketing his cuffs. I suppose we need to maintain order. Let's get these documents to the proper channels." At that, Nicholas exhaled, relieved he was no longer in immediate danger of arrest. But the situation was still fraught. The board's legitimacy was in tatters, and the community was on edge. Mitchell spoke up, voice tremulous but earnest. "If Mr. Ellis is who he claims, an educational philanthropist, then maybe this is our chance to turn this around. Instead of fighting him, maybe we should embrace what he offers, now that we know some people tried to sabotage it." A few scattered claps and murmurs of agreement followed. Nicholas felt gratitude welling inside him. He straightened, reasserting his calm authority. "I'm willing to put my offer back on the table," he said, looking at the crowd. "But under conditions of full transparency, I want you to know exactly what resources I provide, how the training works, and how scholarships are awarded. I'm not here to override your traditions, only to strengthen your students' futures." Ms. Little nodded slowly, her voice softer now. We should consider that clearly. Someone wanted to keep us stagnant. Maybe it's time we took a step forward." Tyler, cornered, tried to rally. "Wait, we need more time. These changes can't be made hastily." But the community had found its voice. Bolstered by the truth, Warren turned to Nicholas, grudging respect in his eyes. "I misjudged you. Maybe we all did." Nicholas inclined his head. I understand why this world makes people suspicious, especially of an outsider. But I hope what happened tonight will encourage us to be more open, to ask hard questions of everyone, especially those in power." Daniels cleared his throat. "We should secure those documents," he said to Warren. "They need to be examined by state authorities. If there's wrongdoing, it's my duty to ensure it's addressed." Warren nodded. "I agree. Let's do this the right way." The atmosphere shifted, still tense, but now charged with possibility. Some in the crowd began to filter out, whispering about what they'd just witnessed. Others lingered, watching Nicholas with uncertain but not hostile eyes. Mitchell moved closer to Nicholas, smiling nervously. "I'm glad I said something. I just couldn't stand by when it was so unfair." Nicholas placed a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "You did what was right, Mitchell. It takes courage to speak out when fear and suspicion run high." Ms. Little stepped forward, voice subdued. "Mr. Ellis, perhaps you could stay in town for a few days while we sort this out. Show us more about your initiative. Let people ask questions, this time, openly." Nicholas nodded. "I'd be glad to. The core of my work is dialogue and understanding. We can arrange a public forum, invite parents, teachers, anyone who wants to know more." Tyler still hovered by the table, grim-faced. He looked like a man who had lost control of the narrative. Nicholas felt a pang of pity for him, who knew his reasons for going along with corruption. Still, pity didn't excuse it. The children deserved better. Warren handed the folder to Officer Daniels, who accepted it with a cautious expression. "I'll take these to the station, lock them up for the night, and contact the proper authorities tomorrow," Daniels said. He met Nicholas's gaze. "I guess I owe you an apology, Mr. Ellis. I acted on assumptions." Nicholas managed a gentle smile. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate your honesty. Let's focus on moving forward constructively." Outside, the noise had died down, replaced by a murmur of voices dispersing into the evening air. Inside the hall, only a handful remained. Nicholas, Mitchell, Miss Little, Warren, Officer Daniels, and the chastened Tyler. A heavy silence settled in, each person contemplating the revelations, the near disaster that could have seen Nicholas unjustly hauled away. For a moment, Nicholas allowed himself to feel the weight of his emotions: anger, relief, disappointment, hope. He'd come close to losing his freedom tonight, all because of prejudice and hidden agendas, but now the door was open to something better. Just as he began to relax, a piercing cry echoed from outside, snapping everyone's attention to the window. At first, Nicholas thought it might be a final outburst from the crowd, but the fear and urgency in that scream were different. It sounded like someone calling for help. Daniel stiffened, hand drifting toward his belt. Ms. Little's eyes widened. Warren rushed to the window and peered out. "What is it?" Nicholas asked, heart pounding again. Warren turned back, face pale. "There's a fight breaking out in the parking lot. I see two people shouting. One's got a piece of metal, a crowbar maybe." Nicholas's stomach twisted. Would violence mar this fragile moment of understanding? Had the tension boiled over into something dangerous? Ms. Little gasped. "We have to stop it before someone gets hurt." Daniels nodded, already moving toward the door, his posture tense and alert. He hesitated before stepping outside, throwing a quick look at Nicholas. For the first time, the officer's gaze carried neither suspicion nor malice, only a plea for help in restoring order, fairness, and safety. Nicholas felt adrenaline surge. He glanced at Mitchell and Warren, who looked equally startled. The crisis inside had barely settled, and now a new threat arose. They had no choice but to confront it. Taking a steadying breath, Nicholas moved toward the door, determined tonight had shown him the depth of the town's troubles, but also its capacity for change. He wouldn't run now. If this community was to heal and embrace the future he offered, he needed to stand firm, no matter what waited outside.